There's just something about 80s commuters cars that makes me just fall in love. They're cars that engineers made to be safe, made to be reliable, with not too much horsepower and shaped like a box. I doubt any of the engineers, or I doubt any of the people who bought these thought, man, 40 years down the road, these things are gonna be collector's items. 100% nobody thought that, but for good reason. They're still prevalent today and they have a strong following. I myself have an old Corolla, but if I didn't get one of those, I would have probably got a Volvo 240 because it is such a cool basic car. Probably the only memory that I have with a Volvo 240 is when I was in high school. There's a lot of cool cars in the parking lot. A lot of people had better cars than me. I was probably at the bottom of the list with my 2003 Pontiac Vibe. But there was guys with Dodge, like brand new Dodge 3500s, lifted, you know, just crazy setup, like a SEMA truck. There was a dude with a Ford Raptor. And of course, there was a billion white girl Jeeps. But out of all those cars, the coolest car in the parking lot, by far, in my opinion, was this Volvo 240. And I remember since the car had no tint, walking by it every single day, looking at those slotted bar headrests. I mean, those seats are just so cool. So in this video, we're gonna be going over the ultimate buyer's guide on the Volvo 240, and we're gonna be going over the years, the trims, the common problems these cars have, rare parts that might add value to the car you're looking at, and last but not least, what would usually be in the video is the rarest colors. But I guess since this car was made for about 20 years, every color is pretty common. And when I asked the Facebook group chat of all the Volvo 240 owners, everybody thought their color was the rarest. So I'm just gonna leave that part out because I have no idea. But the rest, I got you covered. So the Volvo 240 was sold from 1975 to 1993. Yeah, almost 20 years in production of this car. And what's crazy about this is the year before they're about to release the successor to this car, the Volvo 700, the Volvo 240 sold the most it did in any year it was out. So I guess Volvo was thinking, you know what, it's doing so well, why not we just keep on making it, and continued to make it for almost another 10 years. And because the Volvo 240 had different trims throughout the different years, I'm just gonna go through the trims as I go through the years. For 1975, the first year it was out, you could either get the 242, the 244, or the 245. The 242 meant you got a 2-door, the 244 meant you got a 4-door, and the 245 meant you got a 5-door wagon. And if you couldn't get it, the last number was referring to how many doors the car had. For the trims, you could either get the DL or the GL, with DL being the base. So if you're looking at the DL Coupe or a 4-door, you would have cloth interior with no power steering, and the base wagon had vinyl interior with power steering. And then the GL cars came with metallic paint, a sunroof, a sportier steering wheel, a tachometer, power steering, and overdrive on the manual transmissions. And all of these came with the B20F. There was no cool engines yet. This engine put out a whopping 98 horsepower and 110 pound-feet of torque. And if you want to know what the 0 to 60 is on this car, you should probably get that idea out of your head because it's not that exciting. It got a 0 to 60 of 16.5 seconds. That means when you're entering the highway, you're at least going to get 2 to 3 honks in this car for slowing everybody down. You might be the sole reason that traffic starts on the highway. And if you wanted a manual transmission, you'd either get the M40 or the M41. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's a common problem, but we'll talk about that later. And the next big change happened in 1978. And if you bought the 242, you got dual round 7-inch lamps. If you purchased the 244 or the 245, you got 5.25-inch quad lamps. This was also the first year you could get the 242 GT, which might be high up on the list of trims you want. And although it wasn't the biggest deal in the US because we didn't get the high compression engine, it was still pretty cool. All of the GTs sold in the US were Mystic Silver Metallic with black and red stripes down the side, and the suspension was a little bit better with a thicker front stabilizer bar and 30% stiffer springs. And with this version, you were more prone to oversteer than understeer like the base models. In 1979, the plain flat hood was now replaced with the so-called coffin hood that had 2 lines on it that made the center of the hood kind of look like a coffin. It's kind of a far stretch, but it does the job distinguishing the two. The nose of the car did change slightly, and there was some revisions to the rear with the addition of a wraparound tail lamp cluster. For 1980, this was the last year of the GT models, and it was replaced in 1981 with the GLT. You can now buy this GLT trim in any door configuration that you wanted, and this included better tires, stiffer spring rates, gas-filled shocks, front and rear stabilizer bars, 5-spoke alloy wheels, a front spoiler, and leather interior. Now, if you weren't happy with just the base GLT trim, even though it was up there, you could go one step further and get the GLT Turbo. Now, this was only available in the 2-door and the 4-door, and the main addition to the GLT Turbo trim, if you guessed it, was a turbo. This came with a T3 turbocharger and increased the horsepower to 127 and the torque to 150. The GLT also came with a boost gauge, an oil pressure gauge, a volt gauge, unique seats with plush velour upholstery. Who doesn't love an 80s car with velour in it? This also came with power windows, air conditioning, thank God, a sliding sunroof with wind deflectors, and dual power mirrors. Unfortunately, all GLT turbos featured a 4-speed automatic transmission. Another thing they introduced in 81 was the new diesel 240. This came with a D24 diesel engine designed by VW, and unfortunately, you would think that the newer motor would make more horsepower, but this was a big step back, and the only pro was it was a diesel. This made 80 horsepower and 102 pound-feet of torque. Like I said, for 1981, you could not get the GLT Turbo in the wagon form, which would be my dream spec. A turbo wagon. I mean, what is better than a turbo wagon? But my dream got answered in 1982, even though I wasn't born yet, and they came out with the GLT Turbo wagon. And this was actually the only engine you could get for the GLT wagon for this model year. For 1983, Volvo thought the world was getting a little more stupid, so they took out the 242, the 244, and the 245 names and just made it simpler, to all of them being badged as just 240s. They also simplified the trims, and now you could just get the DL, the GL, or the Turbo. The 240 also got a new engine called the B23F with a slightly higher compression that made the engine get 114 horsepower and 136 pound-feet of torque. For 1984, this was the last year you could get the 2-door 240, and you could only get it as the base trim, the DL. This was also the year that the successor came out. But like I said, because they had the highest sales this year than any year that the 240's ever been out, they just decided to keep on making them. The only downside is since the new model came out, 1985 would be the last year the cool stuff would be on the 240. In 1985, they added a intercooler to the B21 FT, and it made the horsepower jump up to 162 horsepower and 181 pound-feet of torque. Now, sadly, the 242, the 2-door 240, was discontinued last year, so you cannot get a coupe with the intercooled turbo engine, which absolutely sucks because that's the one I want, the one that was never made. You always want what you can't get. And this is where it comes to the sad end of the cool 240s. From 1986 to 1993, the diesel disappeared, the turbo disappeared. What you're left with was only the DL and the GL, and you only could get it in a 4-door or a wagon. They came out with a new engine though, but it only made 114 horsepower and 136 pound-feet of torque. This engine was called the B230F. It might be reliable, but it's just not as cool as the turbo. And that's pretty much all for the differences between the years. Now I'm going to quickly go over the trims one more time just so you can figure out exactly what you want. You probably have a good idea, but you probably forgot what years things were available. So the 2-door 240s were only made till 1984. The 244 and 245, on the other hand, were available every year the 240 was available. And the last number was either 2, 4, or 5 until 1983, when all of them just became 240s. DL and GL were available throughout the whole entire model run, while the GT was only sold from 1978 to 1980. Then it was replaced with the GLT, running from 1981 to 1982. The diesel and the turbo were available from 1981 to 1985, and in 1991 you had a special edition called the SE. The SE was pretty much just the same thing as the GLT. And in 1993, you had the option to get the classic trim, which was just the last couple 240s made in 1993. Other than the badge, there's nothing really special about it. Now let's hop into the common problems you want to look out for when checking out the 240 you want to buy. It's an old car, right? So let's first start off with rust. Rust can be a big issue on these cars, especially if you're going with an older 240. And the reason why I say this is not just because the newer ones haven't been exposed to the elements as long as the older ones. It's actually because in 1987, they made the entire body galvanized. So that helps with rust, and you don't have to worry about as much, but still check because it is still an old car. You want to check some of the obvious areas like the rocker panels, the wheel archers, and the floors, but there's also some specific spots to check on a 240. All 240s made before 1977 will be more prone to rust, on the front fenders behind the turn signal lamps. That's because these ones didn't come with a splash shield. The hood, the battery box, the radiator core support, the firewall, and the rear wheel archers are all places that rust can form. A couple other ones are the pinch welds that form the windshield and the backlight opening can rust out, and the gasket and trim will hide this. This particular spot is only for the wagons, and that is the rear window opening. And for the sedans and wagons, check the covered recessed areas on both sides. These often hold water, and where there's water, there's rust. On the other hand, some good news is that the Volvo 240 engines are considered to be some of the most reliable engines ever made. Now, on the earlier cars, there's one problem with the B20 that you might find. The timing gear was made out of two different materials, and they can separate over time, causing some timing issues. Since these are non-interference engines, you'll be fine. You just have to buy the full steel gear that is available in the aftermarket, and you should be good to go. Something I mentioned earlier in the video, the M40, 41, 45, and 46 manual transmissions could fail with just the stock power of the 240. So when you're looking at a 240 that has some power mods, make sure that transmission has been swapped out for either a Tremec or a Getrag or any other transmission that can handle the power better. Remember how I told you at the beginning of the video, nobody thought these things were going to be collector's items? Well, here's proof. Pre-87 240s had wiring harnesses that disintegrated. So make sure to check the engine wiring harness thoroughly to make sure that there's no wires grounding out or there's no wires disconnected, because that will be a pain in the ass. And probably your best bet in that scenario is just to get a replacement harness, because even if you fix one of the wires, another wire will go bad probably soon thereafter. Now, if your 240 is having starting issues, one of the common problems associated with this symptom is the main fuse. These are known to get corroded over time, and the way to fix this is just simply spinning the fuse in their fuse holders, which should reestablish electrical contact. Now for this next one, it's just part of owning a Volvo. The 240 is known to be one of the safest cars back in the day, and even after 10 years it was out, it was still the safest car. And one of the drawbacks to this is that the motor mounts go bad really fast. Mounts were designed to allow the engine to move back and under the car in the case of a crash, and because of this, the motor mounts only last 2 to 3 years depending on how you drive. Now if the 240 you're looking at has idle problems, it could be because of clog in the flame trap system, so if you just clean that out, that should fix it. Another reason for having poor idle quality, hesitation when accelerating, reduced fuel economy, or a loud humming noise coming from the main fuel pump. This could be because the pre-fuel pump is faulty. Now when this pre-fuel pump goes bad, the main fuel pump has to work harder and draws excessive amperage that can make the fuel injection relay go bad too. So make sure to check both if you're checking one. Now one of the first things you should do when checking inside the engine bay is look at the accordion style air intake hose. Make sure there's no rips in there, because if there is, that could be causing a lot of problems. Now if that iconic seat in the 240 feels off, there might be two problems with the seat. First is that the lumbar system might be broken. These usually go bad before 100,000 miles, and also the bottom seat cushion support grid is also a weak spot. If you can't see over the steering wheel and you feel like you're sinking into the seat, that might be the issue. And the last con problem I got for you guys today is the overdrive, relay, wiring, switch, and solenoid. All can go bad and cause problems with overdrive. They should have just stuck with the tried and true and just added another gear instead of overdrive, because that's complicated and a mess, as you can see. But it's too late to complain now, because the car is 40 years old and we just have to fix what's wrong. Now for rare parts, there's not that much, because like I said, the car was out for 20 years, so almost everything is common. But here's a couple things that I found that aren't so common. First of all is wooden interior. If it's on the doors, if it's on the dash, anything like that, it's quite rare. Also, OEM wind deflectors are quite rare, and the Volvo R horn button made by Momo is also rare. And for the last part of this video, I know that we're not going over rare colors, but I will go over a couple rare trims, with the first one being the Classic Edition. Other than the badge and it coming out in 1993, the last year Volvo 240s were sold, it's not that special. But there's one other trim that if you want something super rare you can get, and this is called the Jubilee trim. About only 50 of these were made, and this was made for the 50th year of Volvo, and it is a silver 240 with a gold stripe down the side of it. These weren't sold in America, but 50 of these were sold worldwide, so you could import them because they're old as hell, and they look pretty cool. I bet you'd have to shell out some big bucks for it, but if you want rare, there it is. But other than that, I hope you guys did enjoy this video on the buyer's guide on the Volvo 240. If you have any more things to add, make sure to go down in the comments and leave them, because I know I probably missed a couple things and I'd love your input. Leave a like and join the Discord, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.